Hi everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's Sprintax non-resident tax webinar for the 2021 tax filing season. My name is Anna Fitzpatrick and I'm an account manager here at Sprintax. And in today's session, I'm going to be bringing you through everything you need to know about non-resident tax as we move through the 2021 tax filing season. Some general housekeeping before we start. You may notice the webinar is muted to attendees. However, we do welcome any questions or any feedback that you might have throughout the session, so feel free to use the questions box as we move through the session if you do have any questions throughout. We also will be making a recording available to all attendees, so you'll receive this through to your email inbox tomorrow to the email that you registered for the session with. And also, because it is tax that we're talking about, we generally always have to start off with a disclaimer. And this presentation is aiming to give everyone a general understanding of non-resident tax as it applies to non-resident international students, scholars, and professionals in the US. And we'd say here at Sprintax that tax can be a little bit like your own DNA. And although you may seem nearly identical on paper to your fellow international students and scholars, one minor detail could make you be treated completely differently for tax purposes. So with that said, it's important to keep in mind that each individual has their own unique tax position and is responsible for their own tax determination and tax compliance. But looking at some of the topics we'll cover in today's session, we'll look at an overview of tax for non-resident students and scholars, looking at some core non-resident tax information here, like important dates for the 2021 tax filing season, residency for tax purposes, FICA, state taxes, for example. We'll also go through understanding the implications of filing an incorrect tax return and what that can look like, also looking at the stimulus check and eligibility for the check, and hopefully that will help to address any questions people might still have on the stimulus checks. We'll also go through a Sprintax walkthrough, a step-by-step guide to using Sprintax to prepare your tax returns. And as I mentioned, any questions and discussion, feel free to use the questions box. Your questions may be answered as we move through the session. If not, feel free to pop them in there and we'll address any outstanding questions at the end and any common themes as well. But generally, when we're looking at the tax filing season, typically a good place to start is around the important dates for the tax filing season. And when we're looking at the 2021 tax filing season, we're looking back on the 2021 tax year. So we're looking at the period of January 1st to December 31st, 2021. And we're looking back on that period to any income that you earned during that period, as well as any taxes that were withheld on that income. And really, we're looking to see if you might have over or perhaps underpaid tax to the IRS or to the state tax authorities. And the really important deadline or the really important date when we're looking at the 2021 tax filing season is the tax filing deadline, which as it stands for the 2021 tax filing season is Monday, April 18th, 2022. For anyone who was here in prior tax seasons, you may have been familiar that we had extensions for the last two tax seasons as a result of the pandemic. But as it stands, there doesn't look like there'll be an extension for this tax season. So the deadline stands at Monday, April 18th, 2022. And next up is around residency for tax purposes, which is definitely a topic that tends to confuse a lot of international students and scholars, and it's probably one of our most popular asked questions on our tax webinars. So I'm going to break it down a little bit for everyone. And when we're looking at residency for tax purposes, the first important thing to mention is that it is independent of your visa or immigration status. So generally, most international students and scholars who are on F, J, M or Q visas are considered non-residents for tax purposes. If you're an international student on a J1 or an F1 visa, you'd automatically be considered a non-resident for your first 5 calendar years in the US. And you'll hear that I mentioned it's a calendar year that we're looking at here. So just to give you an example, if Anna entered into the US on December 31st, 2021, but her semester at her university didn't kick off until January of 2022, the IRS would count 2021 as Anna's first calendar year of presence in the US, as she was actually present on US soil during the 2021 tax year. Then if we're looking at scholars and researchers and their dependents on J visas, they'd automatically be considered non-residents for 2 out of the last 6 calendar years in the US. Then after those 6 calendar years, the clocks would reset and you get another 2 years of non-resident status. Then if you've been in the US for longer than that 5-year period, if you are an international student on a J1 or an F1 visa, or that 2-year period if you are a J researcher or scholar, then the IRS will need to use what is called the substantial presence test to determine your residency for tax purposes. And essentially, the substantial presence test looks back on the prior 3 years and it's looking at your days of presence in order to determine your residency for tax purposes. And essentially, the substantial presence test will take all of the days of presence for the current year, then it will take a third of days of presence in the year before the current year, and a sixth of days of presence in the year before that. And if that totals to over 183 days, then you would be deemed a resident for tax purposes. I suppose the good news there is that if you're using Sprintax to prepare your tax returns, you won't need to do too much thinking around that there. I'll bring you through that step a little bit later on, but we do have a residency step on the Sprintax system. We'll ask you residency related questions and we'll let you know if you are a resident for tax purposes so you can file accordingly then. We also have a useful residency summary table with some of the popular visa types with the number of years that you would be exempt from the substantial presence test or the number of years of non-resident status that you'd have, and also some information on FICA exemption, which I'll go through in more detail a little bit later on. But a big and important question is around who must file for 2021. And importantly, every non-resident needs to do something, and every non-resident has some type of IRS filing obligation. The minimum is typically Form 8843, and this needs to be prepared and filed by each non-resident who is an exempt individual and was present on US soil during the tax year. And it needs to be prepared and filed even if you didn't earn any income during the tax year. But I'll go through Form 8843 in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But in many cases, you may have been in receipt of taxable US sourced income during the tax year. For example, you might have been on OPT, or perhaps you had an on campus employment job, or you received a taxable stipend or a scholarship or investment income, for example. And as there's no personal exemption amount for 2021, any non residents who receive any taxable US sourced income over $0 will generally need to file a federal tax return, which is Form 1040 NOR. And some of you may have been familiar with the 1040 NOR-EZ, which was a federal tax return form that was used in prior tax seasons, but it has since been discontinued since the 2020 tax filing season. But looking at Form 8843 in a little bit more detail on what exactly is this form, as I mentioned, it's typically the minimum filing requirement for all non-residents, and it needs to be prepared and filed for each year that you were present on US soil as a non-resident for tax purposes. It needs to be filed even if you didn't earn any income during the tax year. It's a pretty simple form. Essentially, it's a declaration or confirmation of your non-resident status to the IRS. So it's letting the IRS know that you are a non-resident for tax purposes for this tax year. So please don't count these days of presence towards the substantial presence test. If you're using Sprintax to prepare your returns, we'll prepare the Form 8843 for you, whether it's alongside your federal return or if you just need the Form 8843, we can assist with that. Then looking at some of the popular types of US income that you might have received during the tax year that would typically trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. We have employment income, so if you had an on-campus employment job or perhaps an off-campus employment job. If you receive scholarship that covers tuition expenses outside of your tuition and tuition-related expenses, such as room and board, or a stipend, or a housing allowance, or rent, for example, that'll typically be taxable and reportable on your return. Investment income and crypto is something that we're seeing pop up a little bit more often now, and this will typically trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. Other income may be less common, but ultimately will still typically trigger a filing requirement for non-residents, for example, selling art or design, or taking part in a focus group and receiving a gift card, or perhaps if you've rental income over 14 nights, So really, it's important to look at all of the potential sources of US income that you might have received during the tax year, and then your filing requirements as a result of receiving that income. But a pretty common question we get from a lot of our international students and scholars is what type of income doesn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents? So some of the popular types listed here. The first is your scholarship for tuition and tuition-related expenses. So if you have a scholarship that just covers your tuition and tuition-related expenses, and as long as you're a candidate for a degree at a qualified institution, then typically that scholarship for tuition and tuition related expenses would be non-taxable and non-reportable on your tax return. But as I mentioned in the previous slide, if your scholarship covers expenses outside of this, and for example, room and board or a stipend or housing allowance, visa expenses, for example, that will typically be taxable and reportable on your return. Then, if you have received a scholarship from outside the US, for example, if Anna received a scholarship from a college in Ireland to study in the US, that will typically be non-taxable, non-reportable for Anna in the US. Then, money transferred from parents and relatives overseas. So, if you have received money from a parent or a relative to assist you with the cost of living when you're in the US, as that money is coming from overseas, that's typically going to be considered foreign sourced income. And as a non resident in the US, you're typically only going to be taxed on and required to report your US sourced income. And as a result, this typically shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non residents in the US. Next example is similar income earned in your home country. For example, if you still are receiving employment income from a job you had in your home country, or you're receiving rental income from a property in your home country, as the same as the previous example, as that's coming from overseas, it's typically going to be non-US sourced income or foreign sourced income and shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents in the US. Last example, interest on your regular savings account also typically shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents in the US. Next, a very important slide around some of the income documents that you might receive to report the income that you've received during the tax year. And if you receive any of these income documents, you'll need to report them on your tax return. So the W2, the 1042S, and the 1099 series documents. The W2 is probably the most common and will typically outline any wages, salary, or compensation that you earned during the tax year, as well as the taxes that were withheld on that income. The deadline to receive a W2 if you are due to receive one is by January 31st, 2022. Next, and probably second most common after the W2, is the 1042S. And this will typically outline any taxable scholarships, stipends, any income exempt by a tax treaty, any royalty payments, prizes or awards will typically be outlined on a 1042S form. And the deadline to receive a 1042S if you're due to receive one will be by March 15th, 2022. Lastly, and probably less common for that of non-residents, but you may receive a 1099 document to report rental income, investment income, commissions, or independent contractor services, for example. And the deadline to receive a 1099, if you're due to receive one, will typically be by the end of March. So importantly, if you do receive any income documents to report the income you've received during the 2021 tax year, you'll need them when you're sitting down to prepare your tax returns to report that income on your tax return. A quick note on non-resident spouses and dependents. So there are no joint returns for non-residents. So non-resident spouses and dependents would be required to file separately. In terms of obligations, they remain as we've discussed. The minimum will typically be Form 8843. And if you've been in receipt of taxable US sourced income, you'll typically need to file a federal tax return. And there may be state tax filing obligations depending on your circumstances as well. Importantly as well, each dependent would need to mail their forms in separate envelopes. Where that changes is if a non-resident is married to a resident. You can elect to file jointly on your resident spouse's tax return, but we would generally always recommend doing the math on both options first to figure out which is the most favourable for your personal tax position. And next up, looking at FICA taxes. And many of you on today's session may be familiar with FICA taxes, but for anyone who isn't, it's also known as Social Security and Medicare. And it's essentially a tax that is paid into that will help to assist you with the cost of healthcare when you're over the age of 65. And typically, in the eyes of the IRS, as a non resident international student or scholar, you typically won't be here long enough to enjoy the benefits of that tax. And as a result, non resident international students and scholars on J1 and F1 visas should not be paying FICA. However, it's not a blanket rule. If you are on a H1B, a J2, or a TN visa, you would be subject to FICA from the first day of your employment. In addition to this, if you are a resident for tax purposes, you would be subject to FICA taxes as well. It can happen where if you're taking part in off-campus employment and perhaps your employer isn't aware of how they should tax non-residents and they may withhold FICA incorrectly from your pay. If that happens and you're a non-resident international student or scholar on a J1 or an F1 visa and you've had FICA withheld incorrectly, there are opportunities to claim that back. The first point of action is to reach out to your employer and request a FICA refund from them. If they refuse, you can apply for a FICA refund using Form 843 and Form 8316, and Sprintax can also assist with those forms if your employer refuses. But we just wanted to give you a quick overview of the impact of that FICA taxes can have on your wages. So the impacts that having FICA withheld incorrectly from your pay can actually have on your wages. So if we look at the example of an F1 student receiving $20,000 in wages, if they have had FICA withheld incorrectly from their pay, that can result in around $1,500 being withheld that didn't need to be withheld. And when you're applying for a FICA refund, it can be a little bit of a lengthy process and it can take a little bit of time. So this is where it's important to make sure that your employer is aware of your tax position and as a result taxes you correctly to avoid having anything withheld that doesn't need to be withheld. So up to this point, when we've looked at who needs to file and residency for tax purposes, that was on the federal tax side. When it comes to the state tax side, states have their individual state tax rules and state residency rules. Some will say you only need to file if you earn over $18,000 or $7,000, whereas others will say you need to file from the very first dollar. The good news here is that Sprintax can figure out if you need to file a state tax return. If the system thinks you've triggered a state filing obligation, it'll start to ask some additional questions surrounding the state tax law in that state, saving you from being needing to be too familiar with the state tax law, and then we can prepare any relevant state tax return forms for you. Then just a quick note on the ITIN, or the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. Some of you may also be familiar with this, but the ITIN is typically required by an individual who has received taxable income during the tax year and as a result needs to file a federal tax return, but they're not eligible for a social security number. So it can be pretty common among scholarship recipients such as athletes. There's an option to apply for an ITIN ahead of filing your tax return or also alongside your tax return, but the process changes depending on which way you are applying. So in terms of filing an ITIN for before your tax return, you can typically have your documents such as your passport certified by a responsible officer at the school. Where the rules change is if you are applying for an ITIN alongside your federal tax return, you'll typically need to have a copy of your passport certified by a certified acceptance agent or at your local IRS office or your home country passport office or embassy. So just important to keep that in mind, how the rules change when you're either applying for an ITIN ahead of filing your tax return or with your tax return. And we've also included a useful blog here detailing the application process and addressing some of the common questions we get around the ITIN. Another important slide is around the 1098T, and the 1098T is typically a tuition statement that is used by tax residents on their resident tax return to claim an education tax credit. Where we see significant causes of misfiling is where non-residents receive a 1098T, they mistakenly file a resident tax return using a resident software and use the 1098T to claim an education tax credit. So what we see there is that the non-resident has filed incorrectly as a resident and would, as a result, need to file an amended tax return. And also, they would have claimed an education tax credit that they're not entitled to, so they need to go about returning that then to the IRS. So just very important to reiterate that if you are a non-resident for tax purposes and you receive a 1098T, you won't need it on your non-resident return and you won't need it on Sprintax as it's not relevant for tax non-residents. Another common question that we always get is around timelines for a refund, and we've definitely seen this question popping up a lot more as a result of the last two tax seasons, as there was a significant delay in processing refunds and returns as a result of the pandemic. So in normal times, we typically would have seen on the federal side refunds being issued anywhere from between 6 weeks to 6 months. With the pandemic, we saw significant delays in processing returns both for the 2019 and the 2020 tax filing season. So there are some individuals who were waiting a long time for an update on the status of their return or their refund. So don't worry if you were in the same boat. There were a lot of individuals in the same boat as you as well. If you're looking for an update on the status of your refund or your return, you can check out irs.gov/refunds. And on the state tax side, it'll be similar, but will vary from state to state. And we wanted to include a slide on cryptocurrency, as we're seeing this pop up a lot more often among non-residents who maybe trade in cryptocurrency. So generally, non-residents need to report crypto if you did any of the following: converted crypto to a regular currency like US dollars, used crypto to pay for goods or services, sold cryptocurrency, or received coins through a fork or an airdrop, for example, receiving coins or tokens for new virtual currency. Typically, crypto is treated as sale of property and subject to capital gains tax of 30%. And if you're paid Bitcoin for work done as an employed person, this will count as personal services income and should typically be reported on a W-2. And moving into our next section around implications of misfiling and stimulus checks, as well as anyone who might have forgotten to file and might need to backfile. And as we always say, if you've missed a year or filed as a resident by mistake, don't panic, but do set the record straight. For anyone who's forgotten to file for previous tax years, you can catch up and backfile at any stage, and we'd recommend doing that as soon as possible. The good news here as well is that if you are due a tax refund, the IRS are happy to issue that to you if it's due in the previous 3 years. And for anyone who needs assistance with backfiling, Sprintax can also assist with that. As you log into your account, you can select the tax year you need assistance with. We'll bring you through the questionnaire and we can prepare your relevant forms for you. Then for anyone who might have misfiled, so perhaps you filed as a resident when you were actually a non-resident for tax purposes, again, don't panic, but do set the record straight. You would need to file an amended tax return for each incorrect year using Form 1040X, the amended US individual income tax return, and the 1040NR. And Sprintax can also assist with amended tax returns for anyone who might need assistance with them. And the stimulus payments was something that we saw make the headlines over the last 2 years, with non-residents receiving these incorrectly, where they might have filed incorrectly as a resident in the past. So in the eyes of the IRS, they were a resident for tax purposes, which resulted in them incorrectly receiving the stimulus check. So we saw the first stimulus check issued around March or April 2020, the second check issued by the IRS in December 2020, and the third check issued by the IRS in March 2021. And generally, the eligibility criteria remains much the same. It's typically there for US citizens and resident aliens who are not eligible to be claimed as a dependent on someone else's tax return and have a valid social security number. So typically, you won't qualify for this first or second stimulus check if you're a non-resident alien for tax purposes for 2020, and you won't qualify for the third stimulus check if you're a non-resident alien for tax purposes for 2021. So we do have lots of useful resources and blogs and YouTube videos on the stimulus checks, so feel free to check them out if you do have additional questions, or if you have any additional questions and you're joining today's session, feel free to post them into the chat as well. But looking at the reality of the situation and how we saw our amended return statistics jump over the last couple of years as a result of the stimulus check going incorrectly to a lot of non-resident aliens. So in 2019, at Sprintax, we prepared around 330 amended tax returns. In 2019, we saw that jump massively to around 5,500 amended returns. And in 2021, we still had a significant number of amended returns with around 3,500 to 4,000 amended returns. So what we can see here is that the stimulus check going to non-residents mistakenly brought about the idea that they had filed incorrectly in the past, and as a result, they were eager to amend their tax returns and make things right with the IRS, as well as returning that check if they weren't eligible to receive it. A very important slide around some of the implications of not filing. And one that we always want to emphasize and we continue to mention is the impact that not filing could have on your future immigration status. So there may be some individuals on today's session who may be hoping to stay in the US, and you may be looking to apply for a change of status in the future, perhaps to H-1B or an LPR visa. And if you're applying for a H-1B or an LPR or any change of status, it's very likely that you may be asked for evidence of tax compliance. And we would hate to see tax being anything that would prevent anyone from staying in the US. So with that said, tax compliance is a very important element that you need to ensure that you are being compliant with, and making sure that you are filing a tax return if you trigger a filing requirement. You might also be missing out on a tax refund, and as well as that, fines and penalties and interest can build up if the IRS are owed money. A quick note just to be careful about the options that are being recommended to you. So we have seen in recent years that some individuals may be parts of certain social media groups, and they may see individuals who are claiming that they can get them the maximum refund and they can file their non-resident tax return for them. But unfortunately, we've seen a lot of cases where these individuals are actually filing incorrectly, and they're actually filing resident tax returns and filing incorrectly in order to receive those maximum refunds. So this would be a significant cause of misfiling and would lead to you needing to return any money that has been claimed and also amend your tax returns. In addition to this, then TurboTax, you may see or hear of fellow students or fellow friends who may use TurboTax if they're a resident for tax purposes. But TurboTax can only support resident tax returns. So if you're a non-resident for tax purposes, you won't be able to use TurboTax to prepare your tax return. And lastly, moving into the last section of today's session is using Sprintax to prepare your tax returns. So some of you may have received communication from your international or your tax office or your payroll office in relation to Sprintax, and your Sprintax supporting your school or your institution's international population for the tax season ahead. So you may have received an email similar to this outlining a link to Sprintax related to your school or university or institution, and there may also be a discount code included in this that may look at removing some of the cost or discounting some of the cost depending on your school or university. When you follow the link to Sprintax, you'll either set up an account, or if you've used us before, you can quickly log in. And the first step, and one of the most important steps you'll need to complete, is around residency for tax purposes. So we need to figure out if you're a resident or a non-resident for tax purposes. We'll ask you residency related questions like, were you present in the US in 2021? We'll ask you about your visits to the US as well as the visa types you held on those visits. If you're a resident for tax purposes, we will stop you at this point and we'll let you know that you won't be able to continue to use Sprintax as we're a non-resident tax prep provider. But we will be able to point you in the direction of our resident partner for resident taxes, TurboTax, only if you are a resident for tax purposes. If you're a non-resident for tax purposes, you'll be able to continue to the next step and complete your return on Sprintax. We'll also need to gather any income information, so you might have received a W-2, a 1042-S or a 1099, or perhaps you received multiple income documents. We'll ask you which income documents you received, as well as the quantity of each. and then you can simply upload a copy of your income document onto your account and it'll be populated on the system for you. And that's as a result of our new feature OCR, or optical character recognition technology, which will allow you to upload a copy of your income document. So hopefully saving you a little bit of time as you're moving through the questionnaire. You'll also see the support button on the right-hand side, where you can access either our frequently asked questions, where the majority of questions may be answered there, and you can also speak to a live chat agent. So we do offer 24/7 live chat throughout tax filing season. So no matter where you're filing from or what time you're filing at, there'll be someone there to assist you during the tax season with your queries. As I mentioned, Sprintax will also be able to figure out if you've triggered a state tax filing obligation. If it thinks that you have triggered a state tax filing obligation, the system will start to ask some additional questions surrounding the state tax law in that state. And then we'll outline if you have triggered a state tax filing obligation, and you can then use Sprintax to prepare your state tax returns if you wish. Lastly, then, we'll provide you with an order breakdown. So we'll give a summary of the services that have been provided to you. And this is where you'll be able to enter any access code that has been provided to you by your school, university, or institution, and you'll be able to validate it here, and it will either remove some of the cost or discount some of the cost for you. Some of you may have been familiar that last tax season we were super excited to introduce federal e-filing, and this will be here again this tax season. So the option to e-file will be here for federal tax returns. If you're eligible to e-file, this option will be given to you at the end of the process to proceed with e-filing your federal tax return. However, there are some certain limitations on the IRS e-file side, where certain individuals may not be eligible to e-file, and we have included a list of that breakdown in the e-filing blog that we've included here. But if you're not eligible to e-file, don't worry, you will be given a tax pack, which you will be able to print, sign, and mail to the IRS, and you'll be given detailed instructions on exactly how to go about doing that. On the state tax return side, these will also still need to be mailed. Again, we'll give you a detailed instructions tax pack on how to go about mailing them and what address to send them to, as well as if you just need to file Form 8843 on its own, this will also still need to be mailed. But again, you'll be given detailed instructions on exactly how to go about filing your returns. And lastly, just wanted to give you guys a little bit of an overview of some additional support that might be there and that might be useful for your you as you go through this tax filing season. We do have lots of educational videos on YouTube. We have our blog content for tax awareness. So I mentioned it when looking at the e-filing, ITINs, stimulus check, and we've tons of blogs up there, and it'll be updated all throughout the season. We also have our 24/7 live chat available throughout the season. We have tax workshops and webinars just like this one, so keep an eye out for communications from your school or institution around that. And lastly, I just wanted to mention Sprintax Forms, which is a system that may be useful to some of you. It is a software that can be used to prepare any pre-employment tax documents that you might need. So it can be used, for example, if you're going out on OPT or CPT and you want to make sure that you are taxed correctly on your income from your employer. The system can be used for residency determination, tax treaty eligibility, as well as preparing any pre-employment tax documents that you might need to ensure you're taxed correctly, like a W4, W8BEN, or 8233. It can also be used to figure out if you should be FICA exempt or not, so you can then relay that to your employer to ensure they tax you correctly. And all you'll need to do then is print, sign, and provide your forms to your employer to ensure that you tax correctly. Importantly, it is separate to any end of year filing that you might need to do. So as I went through everything on the federal and the state tax side, this is separate. This looks at any pre-employment tax documents. And it's just important to keep that in mind as well.